Good afternoon and welcome to our webcast on culture and conduct. My name is Shona Matthews, the Head of Regulation and Policy at the Chartered Banker Institute, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Ruth Steinholtz, I'm hosting Steinholtz, founder of Arete Work LLP and someone passionate about ethical business practice. As you know from our trailer, today with Ruth's help we're going to look beyond the processes and delve into the basis of ethical behaviour to stimulate your thinking about why conduct and culture matter and why it's not just about compliance. But before we hear from Ruth, a brief introduction. Following a successful international career in law and business ethics and working in many sectors from banking and FMCG to pharma and petrochemicals, Ruth Steinholtz founded Arete Work LLP in 2011. The firm assists organisations globally in managing risk and improving results by fostering strong ethical cultures based upon their values. Ruth describes herself as a generalist, but with an interest in business ethics and compliance. But this doesn't do her justice. She's become a vastly experienced and enthusiastic promoter of values-based ethics and culture change, seeking to help others understand how this can drive effective compliance and better results. She is rightly very proud of inventing the concept of ethics ambassadors, something that has been adopted by organisations around the world, also hardly surprising since she's lived and worked in the US, Singapore, Italy, Egypt, Spain, UK, Denmark, Austria, all with global responsibilities. Ruth's an author of a variety of influential publications on the subject, most recently Ethical Business Practice and Regulation, which she co-authored with Oxford professor Chris Hodges. She remains in demand around the globe, so I'm really delighted that she's been able to find time to join us today and share with us just some of her thoughts. However, if we look at the overview of what's to come, I can't wait to pick Ruth's brains on the topic. We'll aim to contain our discussion to around 40 to 45 minutes. Hopefully it's not just me asking the questions, which is a timely reminder that if you do have any questions during the presentation, you can submit these by using the online function, and we'll try to get to as many of those in the time available. And if not, we're more than happy to take some via the Twitter feed. Before we start though, a bit of information from you. I'm going to ask Ruth why culture and conduct is so important, but if we take a look, which company would you rather work for? We'll just take a few minutes just to see. So we've got the question there, which company would you rather work for? In just a few minutes, and we'll hopefully get a picture. In the meantime, Ruth, maybe you just want to pick out some of the key points on this slide.
So I'm interested to, first of all, thank you very much, Shona, and thank you to Chartered Banker for hosting this webinar. I think that it's a really important subject and, of course, very timely in the financial services industry around the world. And perhaps some of what we're going to be talking about today will seem counterintuitive, but if you sort of keep an open mind and ask pertinent questions, I think we'll get some interesting results. So far, I don't know how many people we have voting, but we've got 88% who would prefer to work for company A, and only 90 for company 90-10. Any more votes?
All right, we'll just give it 10 more seconds, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll close this poll. So Ruth, that's it, looking a bit stable now. We're going to start voting. Thank you everybody for your participation.
So it's interesting that most of you, 90% or 90%, that's strange, it only adds up to 99. 90% essentially voted for company A. And there's a little bit of a trick question because I put profit only in company B, and was the thought being, well, wouldn't you prefer to work for a company that was focused on profit? But it seems that most of you realize that if a company is focused on profit but has a lot of issues in their culture, they're less likely to make money than if their values and their culture contains the kind of positive values that you see in company A. And so there are a lot of reasons for this, but if you look at, if you keep going through another, sorry, the point about company B is it has a very high level of what I would call cultural entropy. So that's simply just the amount of dysfunction in an organization. And if you think about it, an organization, this is an example with 30%, which is a fairly high, sort of moderately high level of dysfunction. But that's 30% of the total energy in the organization, which is non-productive or possibly even destructive. And the rest of you've only got 70% of the energy available in the organization for positive, productive things. And this comes from the Barrett Values Center Cultural Transformation Tools and Cultural Values Assessments knowledge, this is a tool which has been used since the 90s. And in looking at using this tool, the Barrett Values Center has seen that the amount of dysfunction in an organization is related, employee engagement and dysfunction are related in a bad way, in the sense that the most dysfunctional organizations have very unengaged employees, and unengaged employees or disengaged employees are very likely to not be in a position to bring themselves to work and create a healthy organization. So one of the things that I like to do when I work with companies to focus on their culture is to actually get them to think about what is this costing? What is this costing? And you can do a back-of-the-envelope calculation and figure out that, well, okay, if we have these kinds of values, looking at examples of them, what is this doing in terms of lost productivity and lost opportunity, and how likely is it that people will behave and do the right thing in an organization with a high level of dysfunction? So this is just a little bit of background to set the scene for why we care about culture. It isn't just because it will result in lack of compliance, but it's also because it's good for business. So I don't know if there's anybody who still thinks that having a strong ethical culture is not good for business, but there are a lot of reasons why a strong ethical culture is good for business, and why management should think of it as a business driver, not just as, well, we're an overhead or a compliance overhead. Obviously, some of the things are mentioned here. It lowers transaction costs because of greater trust, both within the organization and between it and its stakeholders. A company that has a strong ethical culture is likely to be more resilient. People will bring their so-called discretionary effort to work, and that's been estimated at an additional something like 17% of positive effort that is engaged. And also, and we'll talk about this later, it makes it a lot easier to learn from our mistakes and therefore go in a positive direction rather than a negative death sort of spiral. And of course, better relationships with regulators, reputational capital, etc. But the point is that this is not just about avoiding fines and jail time. It's about making the business more successful. I just had a quick look while preparing for this at the latest EY fraud survey. And it's interesting to note that in answer to the question, how important do you think it is to be able to demonstrate that your organization operates with integrity, 97% of the respondents said it was important. But if you look at other surveys, you get a similar reaction to the question of how important is culture, how important is integrity. But then when you ask leaders the question, do they think their culture is good enough? Do they believe that their culture supports integrity? A very low percentage of them actually respond that it does. And that's kind of disheartening. If we think it's important, why are we not focusing more on culture?
So, Ruth, bearing all that in mind, what are the problems, the dangers, if in an organisation the strength of focus is just on compliance?
Well, first of all, it doesn't work. This is another bit of evidence from EY recent that shows that the financial sector together with pharmaceuticals, I would say, has the highest amount of focus on compliance, but it doesn't actually correlate to reduced incidence of fraud and corruption. And EY says, well, this is a contradiction in terms, that you have strong compliance programs but a higher incidence of fraud and corruption. But actually, I don't think it is a contradiction in terms, because I don't think that compliance is focusing too much on compliance is an effective way of bringing about results. And if we needed any more, if we needed any more evidence of this, another EY slide, the majority of respondents said that management's introduced anti-corruption policies, whistleblowing hotlines, statements of ethics, whatever those are, but we don't see a corresponding decrease in unethical conduct and business failures. So this could be very discouraging if you allowed it to be, but I think the point is that people are focusing on the wrong thing, in the sense that they're using a tick-the-box approach to compliance, and it's not working. So one of my mantras from back in the time when I was general counsel was, ethics is everyone's responsibility. This means you take a different approach. So compliance, if you think about it this way, compliance is an outcome, not an approach. And why is that? Go, and then we'll answer the question. Let's go one more. So, I mean, think of it yourselves. If you work in financial institutions or other institutions, how motivating is it to be subject to excessive, what you would probably consider excessive reporting requirements, all kinds of certifications, tick-the-box training, without any real spirit behind it. So, first of all, it makes one feel that one isn't trusted. Most importantly, it relies on extrinsic motivation, meaning this is the imposition on rules rather than focusing on intrinsic motivation that comes from your own values. And anyone who has children will know that trying to motivate a child based on rules is often, you're on a hiding to nothing, and unfortunately or fortunately that doesn't change as we get older. We're much more likely to do something when it's in alignment with our own personal values. Also, I think a lot of compliance training is uninspiring. It's too complicated. It relies on people memorizing a whole lot of information at a time when they don't need it. And paradoxically, it makes it easier for people to feel that they are not accountable. And one of the things that I've always thought is, if we have 478 people in the compliance department, then why would I think that I was responsible for compliance? So, and then if you're a senior manager, you're thinking, well, all this compliance stuff is just overhead, and we're just doing it because it's the law, and it's not really, so it's something that people aren't going to want to invest in. On the positive sides of things, if you're focusing on your culture and values, as I said, it appeals to your intrinsic motivation, what's important to you, what your values are, and it increases trust between stakeholders. And people who work in an organization that is truly values-driven, and I don't mean one that just has values on the wall, are more likely to be proud of their organization and care if somebody is doing the wrong thing or about to do the wrong thing. And a values-driven organization will have a lower sort of culture risk. And it's a win-win-win. I see we have some questions. Maybe, Shona, I can't see them, so if you can...
Yeah, just thank you. We've had a question come in. We've also had a typo pointed out, so thank you to whoever submitted that. We'll get that fixed so that things are signposted correctly on the attachments. That's currently the Deloitte attachment, the EY attachment's looking like the Deloitte.
Oh, okay.
So we'll fix that after, but thank you again. Ruth, we've had a question in terms, going back to one of your earlier points about why it's good for business. Can you evaluate the financial positive of an ethical culture?
Well,
put it into pounds, shilling and pence.
Well, it depends on the organization, but going back to that slide where I showed you the potentially limiting or the negative values and this question of lost opportunity, lost productivity, an organization can look at the amount of, the kinds of drivers of disengagement which are directly related to culture risk. So maybe I need to skip forward to a concept that I'm going to talk about later, and that is the fudge factor. So the fudge factor is the extent to which you can cheat and still feel good about yourself. This is something that was coined by Dan Ariely, who's a very interesting behavioral psychologist who teaches at Duke Fuqua School of Business. And basically he says that if you have an organization where people can rationalize cheating and still feel good about themselves, then you're more likely to get, obviously, people cheating. So that's why culture is so important in terms of the bottom line. If people are working in an organization where they can't rationalize behaving badly and still feel that they're a good person, they're less likely to cheat. So, for example, there are a lot of things that I could do that you might consider cheating, like crossing the road in the middle of the road or driving a few miles over the speed limit. I can do that and still basically feel like I'm a good person. If I work in a company that I think is treating me unfairly or treating my colleagues and friends unfairly, that is in itself corrupt, then my attitude is going to be, well, I can cheat and it doesn't matter. So there are a lot of different ways that you can look at how a dysfunctional culture, doing the right thing, and bottom line fit together. But one of them is that, and cheating, by the way, might mean cheating the organization. Doing your own work in work time, taking home pencils, paper, reams of paper, all kinds of equipment from the office. So all of those things, committing fraud, will hurt the company, but it's also a lack of a positive.
Not even to get into the aspect of stress-induced scenarios.
Absolutely.
Which also have an impact on the negative value.
That's really important too, because if you think about it, if you are in a position where you're being where in order to sort of go along with the crowd, you have to do things that are not aligned with your personal values. That's going to create a huge amount of stress. And people who have an option will leave the company. So potentially you'll have better people leaving. Are there other questions that are important at this time?
I think if we, thanks to, and keep those questions coming in, I think some of them we might get to slightly later on.
Actually, there is one question here. Is culture measurable, and if so, what metrics would you consider? So I have to admit, a total devotee of the Barrett Value Center Cultural Values Assessment. It's an amazing tool for measuring culture. It was created in the late 1990s by a Brit named Richard Barrett, who was working for the World Bank at the time. And it was originally created in order to help companies be the best that they can be. It is an incredible tool. It not only will help you understand what the current state of your culture is in terms of how much of the energy is positive and how much of it is potentially negative, but it will help you understand where the issues are. And most importantly, and here's the magic of this tool, it shows you what your audience, so your employees or stakeholders feel, are the answers to any of the problems in the culture, and it will help you figure out what your core values truly are. So I mean, there are a lot of different ways to measure culture, but I've never come across one that was as easy to use and work with and as positive in terms of helping you create and improve your culture than this one. And I'm not employed by the Barrett Value Center, by the way, although I am certified as a Barrett consultant.
In which case, I would say that we'll make sure that there are a number of links and attachments which we'll remind you about at the end of this presentation, but we'll make sure that there's a link to that too. Yeah.
Right, shall we move on then before we come back to any other questions? So, okay, I have to admit, I did spend many, many years as a lawyer, so I couldn't possibly say that compliance has no importance. What I am trying to say here is that you need a balance. And actually, I looked at this graphic and I realized that the culture and value side should be heavier than the compliance side. But yes, you do need to have both. Of course, from a regulatory perspective, you can't avoid it, but you do need both. But the point is that there is a values-driven way to do compliance. I'll give you just a quick example of that, and that is, let's say you've decided that you need to rewrite your code of ethics. The compliance way of doing that is to have a bunch of lawyers and compliance people sit down in the compliance department or the legal department and write it, and send it out globally and say, please follow this new code of ethics. The values-driven, and you can be sure that if you did that, it would be useless. The values-driven way to do that is to spend time listening to the organization, talking to them, finding out what's a concern of theirs, asking what formats they want to see it in, all kinds of questions, so that people are involved in the process of creating the code, making sure it is truly values-based, which means by definition the company has to have values, which can be a bit of a stumbling block. I was once asked to help a company draft a values-based code, and when I asked if they had any values, basically the answer was no. So I kind of pointed out that we were missing important elements. But the point is that you have policies, you have all of these things, but they need to be done from the perspective of what are your values. So I'm not saying no compliance, I'm just saying how you do it is important as well as what you do.
So looking at the importance then of creating an ethical culture and a strong culture at that, there's a great interest at the moment, and it's obviously heavily related to psychological studies, but what are we hearing from behavioural scientists about unethical behaviour, its causes, its effects?
So I have to say, this is one of my favorite subjects. So first of all, it's really important to remember that most unethical conduct is actually done by basically honest people. We're not talking about a large population of people in companies that are sociopaths, psychopaths, or criminals. Apparently there's about 1% of the population are psychopaths. Some people argue that the higher you go up in the management chain, the more there are, but I actually don't think that's true. And the other point to make is that most ethical scandals or major ethical problems involve a village, in the sense it takes a village, because you've got to have somebody who's covering up, somebody who's perhaps issuing false invoices, somebody who's, there are all kinds of different people who have to be involved in order for a major ethical scandal to come about. And most of those people are basically people with strong values who've been put into a situation or have gotten themselves into a situation for a variety of reasons, which we're going to talk about now, that have caused them to behave in ways that they never would have behaved in if they thought about it. The two classic ones, the two classic studies or areas of study that people tend to talk about in this area to start with are the Stanley Milgram experiments about authority and the Solomon Asch experiments about conformity. And I think we've got links to YouTube videos about both of them. I highly recommend that you have a look at those links, both for the knowledge but also the entertainment value, particularly of the conformity videos. Stanley Milgram basically was trying to figure out why people in Germany colluded with the Nazis. And so he designed some experiments in New Haven, Connecticut, where he brought men at the time, this was in the 50s, in and put them in a position to be allegedly administering electric shocks to someone who was supposed to be giving the right answers to certain questions, and every time they gave a wrong answer, they were instructed to up the level of electric shock. And the shocking, not too much of a pun, but the shocking result of that experiment was that something like 70% of the people were willing to give what they thought were potentially lethal shocks to people who were in the next room and shouting and screaming that they were going to have a heart attack or actually gone quiet. And they did this because there was a man in a white coat sitting behind them, and every time they balked and said, no, I can't go on, this man said to them, the experiment requires that you continue. So only really very strong-minded ones stopped. Now, there are arguments about whether that was an ethical study in and of itself. It has been replicated as recently as, I don't know, 10 years ago, and it's been replicated in different parts of the world with different groups of people, including women now, and the results sadly tend to be similar no matter where it's done. There are variations of the experiment which tell us some things about what we should be looking out for in companies. Things like the distance from the harm means the more likely people are to do something unethical, essentially. And if you're working together and it's easier to feel it's somebody else's fault, then people are less likely to feel accountable and move on. So the point here is, if you're a leader in a company or in a financial services institution, you need to be very careful what you say and what you ask people to do. Even ethical leaders, I often find they'll give their results presentations or their discussing financial results quarterly or monthly or whatever, and they only talk about the numbers, not how the numbers are made. And so that is intrinsically saying, well, I don't care how you get these numbers, just get the numbers. So it's very important that people in authority recognize just how much power they have over people potentially. The conformity experiment is interesting because basically this is an experiment where they showed a bunch of students, looks like it was in the 60s based on the haircuts in the YouTube video, and they showed them sets of lines, and then they showed them one line and asked them which line, A, B, or C, is the same length, is this line the same length as, and they went around the room. There were, 15 people sitting around the room, and if the people who were in on the experiment gave the wrong answer, there was a tendency for the experimental subject to also give the wrong answer, even when it was very obvious that it was the wrong answer. When they debriefed them afterwards, they asked, so why did you give the wrong answer? I mean, you could see that this line was, it should have been A and you said B. And the answer, there were two kinds of answers. One of them was really scary. Well, they're both scary, but in different degrees. One of them was, I didn't want to go against the crowd. I figured, everybody gave that answer. But the really scary answer was, what are you talking about? In other words, their brains had tricked them into seeing that line as the same, as the right answer, because everybody else was saying it. When they had people write the answer down, far more people gave the correct answer, and when one person around the table gave the correct answer, one of the people who knew what was going on, the experimental subject was far more likely to give the right answer. That, in my opinion, is really important in terms of behavioral psychology, because if one person is willing to stand up for what's right, it's pretty likely that the other people who are sitting around thinking this is not okay, they're more likely to speak up. So those are the two sort of classic experiments. Then there are some other important things that we need to consider. So the fudge factor we've already talked about. And to me, this is, I mean, if any of you come from an accounting or internal audit background, you'll know how important rationalization is. So fudge factor and rationalization go together. Framing is another one. So how you frame your issue matters. If you look at things from purely a financial or a cost perspective, then it's more likely to crowd out ethical considerations. The Ford Pinto, I'm not going to go into Ford Pinto, but you might want to look that up and see how probably very ethical people decided it was better to kill people than it was to retool the production of the Ford Pinto. But look at something even more, I mean, there are other less dramatic examples of that. There was an experiment done in Israeli kindergartens where a bunch of parents were picking their kids up late, and so this Israeli behavioral psychologist professor designed an experiment whereby they started to put fines. If the parents showed up late, an hour late, they had to pay a few more shekels, etc. They had to pay a few shekels as a fine. So I don't know, if you're with me, you might think of what probably happened. Well, what happened was that people started showing up even later because they're sitting at their desk maybe thinking, oh, I've got this £1 million deal or whatever, or I can pay 10 shekels and pick my kid up an hour later, free babysitting. So fines, it crowds out the ethical consideration, which was those people have to leave because they've got their own kids and I'm supposed to be there at 4 o'clock, I have an obligation. A couple of other things, biases, conscious and unconscious. Confirmation bias is a really important one. Those well-known behavioral psychologists Simon and Garfunkel a long time ago said, man sees what he wants to see and disregards the rest. And I think that's really true. And we're doing this unconsciously all of the time. We're looking for confirmation of our beliefs. If you like someone, you have a tendency, by the way, to think they're more ethical. So if you're doing performance reviews, you want to think about that you're far more likely to think, well, whatever this person is doing is probably okay, etc. So there are a lot of, these are just some of the things which are important.
Gentle side steps away towards poorer conduct. Nothing major, but slowly but surely.
I used to not believe in the slippery slope theory because people used to say, well, if you smoke marijuana, you'll end up on heroin, and we all know that that's probably not true for most people. But the slippery slope theory in ethics is actually something, because what happens is you take one little step, which is probably in and of itself legal and okay.
Helpful.
That's right. Then you have to take another step to cover it up, lie, etc. And then what happens is, because we want to think of ourselves as good people, your mind kicks in and starts to rationalize, and eventually you end up someplace where you never thought you'd go and where you wouldn't have come to. So it's that first step that's actually quite important. This might be a good place to take some questions before we move on to the next section, if there are some.
I think we've had one come in that talks about prioritising the gender balance, so what culture, values, conduct, and other specific issues should be considered, because companies are now starting to prioritise. Perhaps not. Maybe if we widen it out and say diversity.
Yeah.
Is diversity going to help with it?
Yes. So diversity helps because to deal with a lot of the issues. First of all, in a culture where diverse perspectives, diverse points of view exist and are respected, so people are able to voice their diverse points of view, you are far less likely to fall into the trap of groupthink, for example, and people will be seeing things from different perspectives by definition. So it is likely to result in a culture that is less prone to these issues. We could argue. I don't want to get into are women more ethical than men, because I don't think they are necessarily. I think there are certain things about leadership styles that are more consensual or more involving of people that are likely to result in probably a culture that will encourage ethical behavior more so than an autocratic, authoritarian type of style, but you have people in all genders using both of those styles. So, but I think leadership style is a big factor, because leaders, let's face it, leaders create culture. Their values and behaviors will create the culture, but it might not be the current leaders. It could be legacy from past leaders, and that's something that people need to be aware of.
Well, we're on the question of diversity. I've heard you speak about the power of three before as well in this context.
Yeah, that comes from my own personal experience. So for many, many years, I was the only female in the room and on senior leaders' teams. And at one point, sort of mid-career, another woman entered the management team. And I have to say that, contrary to what you would have expected, I actually felt that was worse, because what then happened was that all the men thought, oh, well, she's got a companion, so the two of them can go off on their own and we'll go out to dinner by ourselves or whatever, which they wouldn't have done if they thought they were leaving me alone. I think actually also you need a kind of a critical mass of three different people. There has to be women, whatever, before people will feel encouraged to speak up and become a bit more, they get a bit more balance. So I experienced two as being a problem. But that was just my experience.
Well, tapping further into your experience, Ruth, can you share with us some practical ideas and that will be helpful to our audience to help them personally avoid pitfalls, do what they can to help build a positive culture and be part of the solution?
So culture change is a complicated thing, and it doesn't happen overnight. The beginnings of the writing about this in this kind of context, the book on the left, this Law and Corporate Behavior, was written by Professor Hodges, and it's 800 pages long, and it basically completely demolishes the idea that deterrence actually works. And it also looks at various sectors where different things are done and they do work. Because it was 800 pages long, the Department of Business and Innovation and Skills asked Professor Hodges to write a shorter book, to write a paper, and he wrote this Ethical Business Regulation, Understanding the Evidence. And he and I had been sort of behind the scenes collaborating on this, and basically we kind of looked at each other and said, well, we need to write a book that's reasonable size and has some practical considerations in it. And so that's how this ethical business practice and regulation was born. And our goal is really to change the world, just a very minor sort of goal. But what we want regulators to realize that they're either part of the solution or part of the problem, because if they are requiring institutions to spend a lot of time on compliance, that's what institutions will do, and we know it isn't effective. But in the course of writing this book, I kind of looked at my experience in-house and doing ethics and compliance and as a consultant, and we came up with two frameworks, and I'm only going to talk about one now, but that is this leadership and culture framework. And basically, for a company or an institution to change its culture, they've got to be focusing on a variety of different things. And the first is they have to have a strong foundation. And I believe they need to believe that ethics is everyone's responsibility. Because again, if they think it's the responsibility of, I don't know, the second line or something instead of everyone, then it just warps the way that they put their resources into working on the issue. And something which I think is really important as a foundation, in addition to strong ethical values that have been identified through some kind of consultation, is this idea that they need to have an articulated, inspirational social purpose. I think that's just so important, and that's true for financial institutions.
Well, and for those of you out there who are members, that concept of societal purpose, it's very much at the core of what the Chartered Bankers Institute was founded on, and in their application, the professional code of conduct that each of our members signs up to doesn't only compel them as individuals to do their best for their customers, for their organisation, but also for society. And also to each other. That accountability to each other and upholding high standards of ethical professionalism, regardless of who they work for or where they work for, that, all around the world. And we annually run a professionalism index, or have done for the past couple of years, and every year our members are saying that their customers are found more comfortable, or they are more comfortable when they see that somebody has been dealt with by, or they are being dealt with by someone who's taken the time to undertake and commit to individual professional development. So it gives them that community and that reference point, I think, that as we said, they're accountable to each other and not just the corporate body.
And I think this point about dedication to fairness, fairness is an inherent trait. And apparently it's not just inherent in humans, but also in capuchin monkeys. Again, we've put a link into a video, which is a serious video. It's from a TED Talk, where 2 capuchin monkeys were asked to do a task. And initially they were both given cucumber, and when they did the task properly. And they were in side by side so they can see each other. And at one point, one of them is rewarded with a grape when they do the task right, and then the next one, when they do task right, gets a cucumber again. And I really recommend you watch the video to see what the capuchin monkey does with that piece of cucumber, and how he or she behaves when they realize that they're not getting the same lovely thing that their colleague is. So, so fairness is important, a dedication to fairness. And the other thing is this commitment to continuous improvement based on a just culture. If we go to the next slide, this comes from the aviation safety industry. And that is that if aviation safety hadn't moved away from, or if airlines hadn't moved away from this concept of blame, I've been told by sort of people in the industry that we'd be likely to have a plane a week falling out of the sky because of the lack of openness in the culture. So, and I'm sure you've all seen in blame cultures, I suspect there aren't too many of us who've never worked in a blame culture, but what happens is that behavior goes underground. It gets, people aren't honest about what's going on. By the time it comes out through whatever means, whether whistleblowing or a competitor or by accident or by internal audit, it's a major disaster. So the consequences for individuals and the company are very big, damage to reputation, etc. And also, and importantly in this concept, it's hard to learn lessons when people are not able to do proper root cause analysis and be honest. Whereas if you have a just culture, which is, by the way, not a no-blame culture, it's a different concept, but basically it's a culture that is dedicated to learning and not punishing people. So really being able to do proper root cause analysis, obviously you have less harm, things get discovered or prevented, and you can really find out what's wrong so that you can fix it. So to me, in a way, if you're going to try to change your culture, this is one of the places where you have to start. And it's very difficult in an organization where there's been a lot of wrongdoing previously and people are defensive and afraid. The management has to set an example and actually not punish people who have gotten themselves into a bad set of behaviors. If they're psychopaths or criminals or they've done something criminal, we're not talking about those incidents. We're talking about situations where things have gone wrong through a variety of actors behaving in different ways. You've got to learn from that and not punish people. The next area that we thought was important in terms of the framework, sort of looking at people and the ethos of the company, is that the leaders, by definition, have to be committed to strong values and they have to walk the talk. But employees also have to be involved. That's why we invented this concept of ethics ambassadors, which is basically just using or involving people from all parts of an organization, all different functions, all different levels, in helping to spread information about the values, about some of the compliance programs and things like that, and not just having it come from a central compliance department that's far away and speaks a different language. And then these bottom 3 points are kind of all interrelated: tolerance and encouragement of constructive conflict, management that promotes open communication, ethical decision-making, and collaborative atmosphere. In this month's Chartered Banker magazine, there's a quote from Chris Whitehead, Chief Executive of FINSIA in Australia, basically saying that regulation can only go so far. We need to enable competent individuals to apply sound and ethical judgment, et cetera, et cetera. And he says specifically, the required competence includes ethical decision-making that will enable individuals to feel competent and capable of applying judgment. So one of the things I always do when I work with a company is help them create a model, a physical model of ethical decision-making that can be used in both training and actually making decisions. Because people forget steps, or they're not always aware of everything. And then finally, but equally importantly, is this concept of aligned systems and processes. If your systems and processes, not just your incentives and performance management, but particularly those, are not aligned with the values that you're trying to create in your culture, then you're not trying to create those values in your culture. And it's also, you can have things that are working against. You need both positive incentivization and not fostering unethical behavior. And then people need to know what's expected of them and what to do. So putting out a set of complicated policies, an overly complicated code of ethics and all that, it's counterproductive. People will not pay attention, and it will not be effective.
In thinking about how to get the words off the wall, as it were, or out of the corporate literature and list them, we've been asked, and you may choose not to, but can you think of 5 or a number of multinationals for which you would sort of highlight them as best examples of good ethical culture? Or services, that succeeding in
So I guess what I would do is, rather than point to examples, name specific companies, although the one bank which always comes up in this context is Handelsbanken, the Swedish bank. But I think more importantly, what I would suggest you look at is, there's a book called Firms of Endearment, and then of course there's Conscious Capitalism, which is another example of, because Conscious Capitalism, which was founded by the Whole Foods guy, John Mackey, is about caring about all your stakeholders, and it's also about having less inequality within your compensation schemes and things like that. But so those are companies, or those are books that discuss values-driven companies. But I would just say one thing, because I've experienced this. You have to look at an organization, 1, over time, and 2, you have to, things can change. Now, one of the great mysteries of life is, why does it take longer to create a positive, values-driven culture than it takes to destroy it? Because I have seen very strong values-driven organizations, by having changes in terms of share ownership, moving headquarters from one place to another, different leadership, relatively quickly lose. So the question goes from, is this in accordance with our values when people are making decisions, to the observation, this is not in accordance with our values. And that can happen in the best of organizations. So I think it's really important to look at an organization over time and figure out what is the leadership of that organization trying to do, and how focused are they on not just their customers, but also their employees. Because if you care about your employees are going to care about your customers. There's just no getting around that. If you treat your employees badly, they're going to be able to rationalize bad behavior, et cetera, et cetera. They're not going to have the kind of pride in your organization that will drive them to making sure that nobody else, that what's going on around them makes sense. So I sort of dodged the question, but I think it's important to look at really in a wider context.
And we asked earlier whether it was possible to put a pound, shilling and pence on the positive value that good ethical culture can add to an organisation. But maybe if we couch it in different terms about the examples of improved productivity, the impact on brand value, even shareholder returns.
Well, I think you can look at it from two ways. And one of them is very difficult to prove, and that's the absence of fines. And just think about the quantity, looking at it from this perspective, first of all, which isn't the way that I would normally want to do it. But look at the quantity of fines that have been paid and the legal fees in connection with. Outside the financial services industry, you have Siemens, who at the time spent over $1 billion, I guess, or maybe euros. It wasn't just the fines that they paid globally, but the fact that they had their legal fees and their accountants' fees and all of the professional fees in connection with dealing with this global culture of bribery were huge. But I actually think that it's important when you're talking about this with senior leaders to focus more on the productivity gains, the reputational gains. It's hard to put a pound and shilling amount on it because it depends on the size of the company. But I think there's certainly a premium that you can see from this. And there's more and more evidence of this coming out. People are doing more and more research. You could ask the question, and there's a book called Values Shift, I think it's called, by a woman named, and her full name is Lynn Sharp Payne, P-A-I-N-E. Personally, I wouldn't have used my middle name in that case, but she was talking about this way before anybody else. She's a Harvard professor, and one of the points is, yes, your company will be more successful financially if people are doing the right thing, but should that be the only consideration? Shouldn't you be doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do? I'm not naive. I know you have to be able to show financial benefits, and I don't think there's any problem in doing that.
She was perhaps referring back into the Milgram experiment.
Yeah.
There's certainly more I could be asking Ruth. We have just under 10 minutes left of our time with Ruth today, so if you do have questions, please feel free to send them in now. Ruth, we've just been talking about what potentially a positive culture could look like and feel like, but how does a toxic culture develop? So, you've spoken before about the normalization details.
Yeah.
Could you go into that a little bit for us?
So, well, first, how does a toxic culture develop? Well, it develops from the top down, so it's the fish rots from the neck concept, or from the head concept. Leaders who are, and it could come from a variety of different issues, silo mentality, information hoarding, bullying, over control, a lot of different sorts of behaviors by senior leaders can create a toxic culture. And that's why I like to use a values assessment tool to figure out what has created a toxic culture, because there's no point in trying to fix a toxic culture that's toxic because, for example, the systems are all broken and people can't get done what they want to get done, and try to fix that culture by fixing management. But usually there's some element of dysfunctional leadership. But again, it might not be the current leaders. It could be leaders from many years ago, and people are still doing things the same way, or their fear was created in the organization. So I guess the point which I haven't made properly is toxic cultures are basically cultures that are where there's a lot of fear-driven behaviors. People are behaving in certain ways because they're afraid. So you need to create a situation where you can drive out that fear. Normalization of deviance is a way where you can get extremely toxic cultures, because people will do the wrong thing, or there will be some sort of unethical behavior going on, and it just becomes normalized. And people think, well, we're doing this and nothing's gone wrong. So far, nobody's caught us. People are, they never think that it's going to happen to them anyway. And it just becomes how we do things around here, which is the definition of culture. And that's very difficult because it kind of becomes invisible. People don't see it because they think it's okay. And that takes leadership that can come in and really make visible why that behavior is causing issues, change reactions, and eliminate fear in order to be able to change the culture. There's a very good speaker he's an astronaut, and he talks about how normalization of deviance, for example, caused one of the space shuttles to blow up, not Challenger, the other one, because they'd been getting foam breaking off of the shields in previous shuttle reentries, and it hadn't destroyed the shuttle. And so people just got basically apathetic and thought, well, it's fine, even though it's wrong. And then, of course, it destroyed the next one.
And does that in part then answer the question which we've had come in, where there's been a lot of talk for many, many years now about social missions, CSR, any number, I'm not going to call them fads, but
yeah,
but yet the corporate scandals keep coming. Is what you're talking about a mixture of all of that, or is it this focus that compliance will fix it?
Well, it is. I think basically what we've had is, ever since the beginning, and really this comes from the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the U.S. and the SEC and the Department of Justice, this focus on compliance, processes. Until relatively recently, people really have not acknowledged that they have to work on the culture. The problem that we have in organizations is that culture is thought to be the province of HR, that compliance and legal are siloed from HR, management, etc. And in fact, culture is not the province of HR, it's the province of everyone, but it needs to be the province of the CEO and come from the top. But also it has to be everyone feeling a sense of responsibility and accountability and not thinking this is somebody else's responsibility. But I think because we haven't had, and many organizations have used, for example, the Barrett Value tool that I mentioned earlier to measure their culture. And some banks, for example, have used it and not only shown over a period of years that their culture has improved, but their financial results, their productivity has improved, etc. And there are some case studies about that I could share. But I think until you get a real acknowledgement that we have to look at organizations holistically, meaning we have to look at all of these different things, and that culture is not more compliance. So my biggest fear now is that, okay, people have discovered that culture is important, but when you ask people in compliance, what are they doing about it? They're doing more training. But there's no concept that really, this is an organizational development, this is a behavioral ethics, this is a complicated, multidisciplinary, multifaceted issue that needs to be tackled by coalitions of people in organizations working together to create the best organization that they can.
I think we've got time for just one more question, so I'll see if I can squeeze this in on that. We'll cut to the positive note of a question that's come in from Nick, who's asked about the long-term impact of the financial crash, and negative or positive, but I think if we look at what extent has the impact been positive?
Well, so I have actually seen some case studies where organizations, for example, even asset management organizations, etc., who lived through the financial crash, those that had values-driven cultures actually suffered less and recovered more quickly. One of the biggest things that I've seen in terms of looking at culture since the financial crash is that excessive cost reduction has caused a lot of fear and anxiety in organizations, and people feel that they're trying to do too much with too little, and that is a recipe, obviously, for difficulty. But I think that the financial crash has made people more aware that of the importance of financial institutions for the global economy, and perhaps created a bit more of a sense of responsibility. I'd like to think so, but I still think we have a long way to go to getting out of this compliance mentality and into a long-term social purpose foundation for creating institutions that are good for the global economy and where people feel comfortable be able to bring their values to work and do the right thing.
Ruth, sadly we could go on and dive even deeper into this, but sadly that's all we've got time for today. So thank you, Ruth, for your insights. I know that the references you've made, we'll get them all up there. Somebody's asked about that. We'll get as many of those up there as possible. I'd encourage you to look at the monkey cucumber grape experiment as soon as you get off.
It's hilarious.
And thank you to you, our audience, for your interest, for your participation. Great questions. If you still have something that you'd like to ask, please get them in. You can use the Twitter feed for that, hashtag Culture and Conduct. For members of the Institute, please do remember that today's webcast can be registered as part of your ongoing CPD using the logbook in the members area of the website. The slide pack will be made available to all listeners today after the presentation. We'd also welcome your feedback on today's webcast. But once again, thank you, Ruth, and thank you very much to all of you listening today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you, Shauna.